I've been having some major car trouble, and it looked like my car was going to be in the shop for up to 2 whole weeks. That meant that for 10 whole days, I'd have to take the bus to and from work. It was an inconvenience, sure, but I'm not so stuck up or sheltered that I was dreading taking public transport or anything. My main concern was getting caught in a rainstorm or something, but investing in a sturdy umbrella pretty much put those fears to bed. If I'd only known that the trouble with taking the bus wasn't the time spent or the exposure to the crazy weather we get here in the Pacific Northwest. It was the people I'd be riding with, or more specifically, one person in particular. So another thing that sucked about having to take the bus was how much earlier I had to wake up. Okay, 30 minutes earlier isn't all that bad, but it still sucked seeing 6:30 instead of 7 a.m. I'd have to be at the bus stop by 7:15 in order to be at work by 8 a.m., and given the area I was living in at the time, this usually meant I had the bus stop to myself. But then, either the third or fourth day I arrived at the stop, I discovered I wasn't alone. At first, the guy just looked like a construction worker as he was wearing heavy boots, jeans, and one of those big, warm, highlighter pen jackets with reflective strips on it. I didn't pay him any mind. It was way too early to interact with anyone, so I just stood there under the shelter just listening to my podcast. Next thing I know, I feel someone tapping on my shoulder. There was literally no one else around, so of course it was the guy in the construction jacket. So then I take out one of my earbuds, turn to him, and ask him if I can help him, to which the guy repeats, "Good morning," in this passive-aggressive way. I assumed he thought I was just ignoring him, so I apologized and made it clear that I just couldn't hear him. Only right in that moment, I swear I smelled one of the single grossest smells ever. It was a mix of the guy's breath and his general odor, which I guess I hadn't picked up on at first because it was so cold outside. If I had to guess, I'd say the guy hadn't brushed his teeth in a freaking decade, and this was sharply evidenced by the state of his mouth. Honestly, it looked like his mouth had died. It was just waiting for the rest of him to catch up. It was truly awful, and I found myself severely pitying the people who had to work with him, not to mention myself who had to share a bus ride with this guy. I tried sitting as far away from him as possible, but I swear to God, he literally followed me right to the back of the bus to sit on the opposite seat. And yes, you guessed it, he tried talking to me the entire time. I know what some of you might be thinking at this point. Just take an Uber, or stagger your schedule to avoid the guy. Well, I already spent $45 on a month's Orca pass, and I wasn't exactly in the best financial situations at the time, so that was definitely guiding my poor decision making. That and the guy wasn't at the bus stop every morning, so not at first anyway. So I figured I'd just suck it up and keep using my card. But then he was there another morning, then another morning, always trying to talk to me until it was on the verge of being harassment. Then one day I get a call saying my car would be ready the following afternoon. I mean, I'd only have to take the bus like one more time. And I was elated, but naturally my not-so-secret admirer was waiting for me that final morning. I had already asked the guy to leave me alone by that point, and he just wasn't taking the hint. So to try and get back at him, I decided to give his employer a call to see if they knew what he was getting up to while in uniform. And when I say in uniform, he had a company pass hanging around his neck, and his jacket had the company name on it too. So I looked them up, gave them a call, and told them one of their employees wouldn't leave me alone. I know that these days that probably seems like a super Karen thing to do, but to me, it was preferable to getting the cops involved, and all I wanted to do was just sort of scare the guy, not actually get him fired or anything. But none of that mattered anyway, because when I called the company to describe the guy to him, including dropping his name, the secretary hit me with a, "Oh, we fired that guy months ago. He didn't return his uniform, so we took it out of his paycheck." That's when it hit me that after that first chance meeting the first week I was riding the bus, he'd only been there to harass me. He sure wasn't catching the bus to work, at least not to work for the company whose pass he had, so the idea that I was totally oblivious to the fact that I was being stalked, legitimately one of the worst feelings of my life. Only thing is, as bad as things seemed right then, they were about to get so much worse. So, I was back to using my car. About 2 weeks had gone by since the whole ordeal with Poop Mouth, and I was halfway to forgetting about the whole thing. Then this one evening, I finish late at work and get home at like 6:45. It's dark, it's cold, and I'm starving, and all I want to do is just curl up on the couch and go to sleep. My apartment at the time had 2 locks, each requiring a different type of key. You unlock the first one so you could use the second to actually open the door. But when I go to unlock the first lock, it seems like my key is jammed. It wasn't. It's just that lock hadn't been locked at all. It wasn't out of the question that I'd just forgotten to lock it that morning, but it was like a built-in part of my routine. It seemed really odd that I just neglected to do it. Anyway, I shrugged it off, too focused on my planned pre-dinner of coffee and molten hot Pop-Tarts, and then walk into my apartment. And that's when I smell it. It was that same rotten mouth smell that had clung to the bus guy like a dark cloud. It's weird how your brain just files those kinds of smells away, and the moment you smell them again, certain memories just come flooding back. Well, it was exactly like that as I stood in the dark hallway of my apartment. Hand on heart, I think that's the most terrified I've ever been in my life. Just like knowing he was close without being able to see him. I just bolted back out of my apartment, back down into the parking lot of my building, jumped into my car and called the cops. The whole time I'm looking up at the second floor windows of my apartment, just waiting to see him moving around my apartment or something, but there was nothing. It got to the point where I thought I might be going crazy, that maybe it was backed up sewage or something and I just had the dumbest panic attack in the history of panic attacks. But still, the cops show up, I let them into the building, then direct them up to where my apartment was, telling them that the door should still be open. By that point, I figured they go in, find the dead rat in my toilet bowl or whatever it was. Legit happens in the Pacific Northwest. Please go ahead and look it up, and then just leave. What happens next will stay with me for the rest of my life. So, if you remember, I'm watching my own apartment windows from my car, while the cops are on their way up to search my place. I think the next thing I'm going to see is the cops walking around my apartment, probably complaining about this crazy woman downstairs who's scared of bad smells. Only, the next person I see turns out to be Poop Mouth himself. He's not wearing his jacket or anything, but his greasy gray hair gave him away from a mile off. He literally ducks behind my apartment curtains, probably after the cops had announced themselves, and he tries to stand as thin and still as possible. I couldn't believe he'd done something so incredibly dumb. They were pretty thin curtains too, so it wasn't like he was going to fool anyone. But the moment one of the cops appeared in my window, I watched the guy pull something out of his jacket. I don't know if it was a knife or a gun, but the cop was basically wise to the whole thing and immediately tasered him before he could make a move. But the whole time I'm just watching this whole thing unfold, feeling completely and utterly helpless, all the while screaming, "Look out, he's got something," with literally no one able to hear me. I stayed in my car for everything that followed, and I actually watched the cops leading the guy out of my apartment building in handcuffs. It was like an actual nightmare knowing he'd been waiting in my apartment for me, all after I thought I was completely rid of the guy. The only good news was that he'd violated probation and was headed back to prison to finish the latter half of an 8-year sentence for the exact same crime, only committed years before. It was a relief knowing that there was no chance of running into him for another 4 years, but it was still haunting to know how close I'd come to whatever it was he was planning for me. In a way, I should be weirdly thankful that he didn't take care of himself, because if I hadn't been able to smell him as soon as I walked in, I might not be around to be writing this right now.
I recently learned of some chilling details about a person that was heavily involved in my life as a child, and I thought that I would share the story. Throughout my childhood, I was extremely shy and did not find myself going out of my way to make friends in new settings. I had recently started preschool at my grandmother's church, and I remember being on the playground playing by myself when a woman introduced herself to me. Her name was Candy, and she looked like any other sweet old woman. She almost reminded me of my own grandmother, with her abundance of white curls on her head. Candy was a volunteer at the church and typically watched over the children while they played, so we would see each other fairly often. I can't remember much about the start of this friendship, but I presume one thing led to another before I was frequently spending time with her in and out of school. My parents were grateful to have someone who was interested in watching me, and I was the youngest of three, and my parents worked full-time while also taking my brother and sister to and from school, sports, and friends' houses. So having a helping hand was a blessing for them. To be honest, I don't remember too many details about spending time with Candy, but I suppose we spent our time frequenting ice cream shops, parks, etc. I do have one memory of going to her house where I had never been before, and as she was showing me around, I remember passing through the dining room and seeing another girl who looked to be around 10 to 12 years old. Candy introduced me to her and told me that she lived down the street and would spend a lot of time at her house. I'm not sure why, but I remember being jealous. I guess I was jealous that Candy also cared for and spent time with another little girl. I had never felt that way before, and I'm not sure why I remember that so clearly. For some reason, that was the only time I went to her house. Fast forward a few years and I'm in first grade. I had totally forgotten about Candy and had not seen her since I had graduated preschool 2 years prior. My neighbors who I carpooled with had dropped me off at my house after school one day, and I spotted a Target grocery bag hooked to our front door. I wasn't sure what it could be or why my brother or sister didn't bring it inside when they arrived home from school, an hour or so before me. Once I took it inside, I noticed writing on the bag indicating that there was a gift inside for me from Candy. I ran up the stairs into my room, and to my surprise, there were several adorable brand new outfits inside just for me. I immediately tried them on and was so excited to show my mom when she came home from work. After my mom got home, I eagerly showed her the outfits that Candy had left for me. Unfortunately, my mom was not as excited as I was. In fact, she was quite angry. She yelled at me to take them off and that she would be returning them to Candy. I was so confused as to why she was upset with me. What did I do wrong? These were free clothes, a gift. Wouldn't it be rude to return a gift to someone? And to avoid being punished, I put the clothes back in the bag and handed them to my mother. We never spoke of this again, and Candy slipped my mind for the next several years. A few years ago, my sister was home visiting from college. With nothing else to do, we decided to go to Target to shop for useless things that we didn't need. As we were walking through the parking lot, the thought of the Target bag from Candy randomly dawned on me. I proceeded to laugh and asked my sister if she had remembered, and if she knew my mom was in such an awful mood that day to force me to give the clothes back to Candy. My sister stopped dead in her tracks and said, "Wait, do you not remember what Candy did to us?" Taken aback, I shook my head and begged her to tell me what had happened. She refused to talk about it and told me to ask my mom. Once again, the thought of Candy had slipped my mind, and I didn't remember to ask my mother about what had happened until I was in college a few years later. We were saying goodbye to my grandmother after grabbing lunch when she had mentioned to my mom that someone's funeral was that weekend. They then sat in silence for a few minutes, just staring at each other. After my grandmother left, I asked my mom who they were talking about, and she informed me about Candy's death. The realization that I had never heard the true stories about this woman crossed my mind, and I asked my mom about what my sister refused to speak on. My mother proceeded to relay the horrible stories to me about the little old woman that tried to take me away from my family. At the beginning of the friendship, Candy genuinely was a big help to the family and was someone that they trusted. However, Candy's intentions were questioned by my grandmother, who shared a few of her concerns with my father after hearing some odd stories from her friends at church. She felt as though something was off with Candy, and she didn't like that I spent so much time with her. Coming from a woman who never had a negative thing to say about anyone, my father became slightly wary of Candy, but he assumed that my grandmother was just being overly cautious. After some time of Candy watching over and babysitting me, her demeanor changed and she started acting possessive of me and became hostile towards my parents. She would show up unannounced to our house asking for me, and if I wasn't there, she would become incredibly angry and yell at my parents about how awful they were. She would continuously tell me that they didn't deserve me and only she was worthy of taking care of me. This happened several times before my parents told her to stop coming to the house or they would call the police. This inclined her to start calling the house and leaving messages for me, which my parents obviously would not tell me about. In these voicemails, she would cry to me and try to convince me to leave with her and to leave my family. She would talk about how awful my parents were and how she could give me a much better life than they could. The voicemails that were intended for me soon turned to threats for my parents. She threatened to call the police or child services to have me removed from the home and placed into her care. She threatened to tell the police about my parents' violence and abuse towards me and my siblings, none of which was true. Once she realized that her phone calls were not working, she began making efforts to show up at the house again. She started by driving up and down our street day after day. She would ask our neighbors and then the neighbors' children if anyone knew if I was home or where I was. She would park her car and watch our house without anyone really noticing or saying anything. Eventually, our neighbors began recognizing her car and what was going on, and they would inform my parents when she came around asking about me. After some time of doing this, she took it upon herself to come to the front door while only my brother, who was likely only 12 at the time, and I were home, and she started banging on the door begging to see me. My brother opened one of the front doors, keeping the storm door between them closed, and told her to leave. She proceeded to plead with him to let her in, and he replied that I was not home, despite me napping soundly upstairs. Cheers for smart 12-year-old brothers. Candy partially forced herself through the door when my brother put his hand in her face, pushing her out of the door, and told her that the police had been called. She left after that and distanced herself for a while before she encountered in the final straw with my mother. One day, my mother and I were backing out of the driveway to attend a birthday party when Candy pulled in between our car, blocking us from leaving. She came up to the window and my mother rolled it down, ready to tell her off for good. Candy ignored her and looked right past my mother into the back seat where I was sitting. She said to me, "Wouldn't you rather come with me and never see your mom again? I love you so much more than they ever did, and can give you everything you want if you come with me." This was the final straw for my mother. She never thought that she would be upset or fight with an old woman, but the day had come when it was absolutely necessary. She screamed and yelled at her, making sure to include that Candy would regret the day that she ever came into contact with me or my family again. Something she said must have actually scared Candy, because she drove off and didn't appear in our lives again until the Target bag incident. I'm not sure how I never knew that any of this had happened, and never thought anything was weird about her when I was a child. But I guess my parents did a good job of shielding me from the horrors of the situation. After hearing about everything that took place, I assumed there must have been a reason she became so obsessed with me. Did she not have a family of her own? Did she lose children or grandchildren and wanted to find someone to fill the void? According to my mother, she had several children that were much older than me, as well as young grandchildren. Thus, I'm not sure what would have sparked her interest in me, but thankfully, we no longer have to worry about her. And part of me still wonders if I repressed any memories or conversations with her that were upsetting. And did she ever privately talk to me about how awful my parents were or how she wanted to take me away from my family? Did I ever agree to leave with her? I also wonder if, as I grew older and joined social media like Facebook, did she ever search my name? Did she ever watch me when I was in middle school, high school, or even when I went away for college? I have so many questions, but I'm glad that we never had to find out if she was going to follow through with any of her threats. As a word of advice, always trust your grandmother's instincts about other grandmothers, and do not befriend the old woman volunteering on the playground.
When I was little, around 4 years old, I lived in Okinawa, Japan with my Japanese mother and my American father, who at the time was stationed on one of the military bases on the island. We lived off base in a house and things were great. But before I get into the story, let me just give you a little background information. Before I was born, my mother was dealing with a Yakuza for some time and she ended up owing them money. She managed to get out of that situation without paying them when she got with my Marine father, and the Yakuza would never hurt an American, so my mother knew she was safe as long as she was with him and on the military base. I have no idea why we lived off base at the time when I was born, but we did. So one evening, I was in my room upstairs playing when my mother comes in, frantically shutting the door behind her, locking it, and turning off the lights. She tells me to be quiet when I ask her what the matter was. She scoots next to me and I can hear her silently crying. My father was at work, I believe, at the time the incident was happening. My mother and I heard the front door slam and then footsteps walking up the stairs. We see the silhouette of the person walking in the hallway from the light peeking underneath my bedroom door. My mother, who was panicking like crazy and praying in her mother tongue, gets a hanger to use as a weapon. At this point, I'm crying like crazy. The doorknob starts to jiggle and jiggle and jiggle until it stops. I remember that they're gone, but we didn't dare leave until the police came, and that's all I can remember from back then. As an adult now at 23, it took me years to put the story together. My mom still denies it like she does when I ask her about a certain part of her past. My dad doesn't even bother to answer the questions and just disregards it. But I know what happened, and even if it wasn't the Yakuza for sure, someone other than my father came into the house and tried to get into my room. I lived in the Rogers Park area of Chicago for several years. In 2018, we had a series of shootings within the span of a few weeks that were connected by no other factor other than the method by which the victims were killed. Shot in the head at point-blank range by a man wearing all black. Black ski mask, black shoes, black clothes. Perhaps the creepiest feature he had was a duck-like gait, earning him the moniker Duck Walk Killer. Everyone lived in sheer terror for a short period of time, always walking with somebody and never alone, and eyeing other people in the neighborhood with vague suspicion. Could that be him? At least I did anyway. One of the victims was an older man walking his dog in the morning. Another was a young fellow shot playing Pokemon Go while walking near the lake at night 2 blocks from my house. He was the second victim. At night on October 1st, I went down to my car to pick my boyfriend up from work when I heard a loud popping sound from the direction of the beach. I wasn't yet acclimated with city life and lived in what I thought was a safe area, so I didn't make the connection that it was probably a gunshot. Dumb, I know. Also, no one had yet figured it was a spree killing because only one man had died so far. It was silent out, so the sound did spook me just because it was loud and unexpected, but I just got in my car and left. the next day is when I read about the second victim. Nothing rang any bells until I read where and when he was shot. Around 11, within 2 blocks of my house, point-blank range in the head. I made the connection that I may have heard the young man get shot when going to pick up my boyfriend. They never caught him despite them trying for a long time. I often wondered who he was and where he went, and if I could have been the one who died had I been somewhere different that night. I can't post images, but you can go ahead and look him up. There's some really scary photos and videos of him running in broad daylight. My name is Charles. I'm an assistant manager at a sub shop, but back when I was just a shift manager, we had this employee named John. John was only working for us for about a month when he called us in to pick him up from his roommate's house because of some problems they had. We took him to our place and had a couple of drinks with us, and we ended up cheering him up. He was always quiet about his social life, but he would talk to people on Tinder and meet up with a date, or would go to a store he liked shopping at that was across the street from us. He stays with us for about 2 weeks, and he tells us that he planned to hang out with a friend. My fiancé gives him a huge hug since they became really good friends. He leaves our place and doesn't come back for a couple of days. I get worried and try to get in contact with him, but somehow we couldn't find his profile on any social media platform, and whenever we called, his line was completely disconnected. It was almost like he went poof and disappeared. He left all his personal belongings behind along with his clothes. This was very out of character of John to do so. We were trying to figure out what had happened and hoped he was still with his friend, but we eventually just accepted that he just left with no warning. A couple of days go by and I'm at work in the middle of my shift, and I see this really tall middle-aged man walk in the store to get a sub, and as I begin to ring him out, he kind of stares at me, and I look back to ask him if I knew him. He asks about John, and this creepy vibe just radiates from him, and I asked him what kind of affiliation did he have with John, and he just looked at me again and said he was a good worker. Then he walked out, and I never saw him again. And then we got a call on the store phone, which so happened to be his grandmother, who filed a missing persons report because she was someone he spoke to every day, and ever since then, there had been no trace of him, and something tells me that that guy had something to do with it. But something told me to stop asking questions, because I've never felt chills like I did talking to him in that moment. We were arriving at my friend coworker's house after work. There were 5 of us with her boyfriend already at home. It was around 10:30 p.m. As we entered the small duplex, I locked the front door behind me from habit. Not 30 seconds after I made it to her bedroom, 5 feet away, I hear someone trying to open the front door. I proceeded to ask if she or her boyfriend were expecting anyone else, and they said no. Her boyfriend went to the door as the person outside started knocking. We looked outside to see someone with a hoodie pulled all the way over his face and was obscured from the side. Her boyfriend asked through the door what he needed, and he answered that he was locked out of his house and needed to borrow a phone. Her boyfriend told him no, and the guy says, "Come on, man, just open the door." We said no and to leave. There was a 24-hour gas station literally across the street. 15 minutes later, I see someone peek into the living room, and someone again tried to get the door open. We all come to the door and yell through, telling him to leave, and he keeps saying, "I don't know why you can't just open the door. Just open the door, let me use your phone." They said no, and he eventually left. While he was outnumbered, we didn't know if there was someone with him hiding, he had a gun, etc. It mainly freaked me out that he kept trying the door before knocking, though. I used to live in a trailer park for my sophomore year of college. It was a really nice city, super liberal and hippy-dippy. My 2 roommates were off in class, but I took the day off school as our dishwasher just broke and I had to wait for the repairman to show up. It was one of those ridiculous anytime between 11 a.m. and 5 p.m. things. I did not want to wait a day longer as my roommates sucked at hand washing dishes and I would have to wash them all again as I cooked most meals at home and we had a limited kitchen set. Anyway, I sleep in till about 10:45 a.m. and my alarm goes off. I probably milled around for a few minutes, then got in the shower, not expecting the repairman to be around till afternoon. I was butt naked and had a head full of shampoo when I heard someone knock on the door. I start washing up as quick as I can when I hear more aggressive knocking. Dude is waiting like 5 seconds between each volley of knocks. Thinking he must have been knocking for a while and I didn't hear him in the shower, I was feeling bad for making him wait. As I'm drying off and quickly putting on some clothes, I hear a very loud boom come from the door. I kind of second-guessed myself and thought, did I really just hear that? And stopped for a second. And then I hear another loud boom and I definitely could make out the noise of my door being forced in and opening. I thought about going to my room to retrieve any one of my 3 guns, then I realized they were still all in their cases after my last range day with the locks on them. I was almost smiling at the irony of all my preparations for this specific scenario, and I got caught lacking the one day it all mattered, naked and afraid. I heard some call out, "Hello?" And I decided to go meet my maker in a t-shirt and a towel wrapped around my ding-dong. I figured if there was a fight coming, maybe they would second-guess getting my half-washed nuts rubbed all over them. I walk down the hallway and lean out into the kitchen, which has a vision of the front door. My door had been smashed in all right, and the wood frame was shredded. I caught the gaze of a scrawny man, about my size, 5'10", holding a sledgehammer standing just beside my ruined door. He honestly looked just as surprised as me and he says, "So sorry, I didn't think anyone was home." And just bolts away. Takes off. I'm not even kidding. I'm like as confused as can be, just looking at my smashed-in door, half unclothed like an idiot. I finally throw on some pants and go outside to investigate, but it was far too late to catch the culprit. My door had 2 huge dents in it, but it held up. Just the frame had been beaten in and left 2 gashes going in, one where my doorknob was and one where my deadbolt was. I had a suspicion that it was not a burglar, so I called my dad and asked him if the repairman he had sent just came by and explained what just happened as best I could. He said he would call me back. I get a ring from him a few minutes later while I'm seeing if I can salvage the door, and he sounds livid. The contractor they sent was mistakenly told the job was for an asbestos test. Typically, what has to be done before a trailer is taken to the dump. The guy must assume the home was vacant and let himself in after a courtesy knock and got scared when I was home and ran away. The part that made my dad angry was they had tried to say that we had to pay for the damages for some smooth-brain reasoning the greaseball manager came up with and ended with a "see you in court" from my dad. He told me to photograph anything we could use as evidence and he would drive over to help me fix my door as he was only about an hour's drive. Making a very long and boring story short after that, it all ended with a contracting company deciding to just cough up $200 instead of going to court, and the cherry on top was that they sent the man that beat my door in back to give me the most awkward and rehearsed apology. I was reminded of the story as I drove past their office today and saw the doors were shuttered and everything was gone, hopefully out of business and no longer sledging doors in for surprise tests. As a preface, I, a 24-year-old female, am not a big partier. Although I live in a big city, I never have more than a few drinks while out. My parents were both alcoholics, so I really try to set limits. I always eat food beforehand and drink plenty of water. Anyway, I meet up with an old friend, Jay, for the first time in a year and a half. We decided to grab dinner together, so she suggests a cute little place where she used to work. Once we get there at around 5:45, we're seated in the back and order a glass of wine and a huge bowl of pasta each. We enjoy our dinner and another glass when Jay's old manager comes over. He offers wine on the house, so we decide to stay and grab another glass, a total of 3 glasses, and end up paying a super cheap tab. I felt good and was planning my commute home. This is the last thing I remember. I woke up the next morning at my friend Jay's apartment completely confused about what had happened the night before. Apparently, while drinking our 3rd glass of wine, we were moved and seated at the bar where she left to go to the bathroom. While she was in the bathroom, I somehow made it upstairs into her old manager's office. She found me pretty quickly, I guess, but she said I seemed really drunk and she called a friend to give us a ride up to her apartment. At some point during the ride from this restaurant to her apartment at 9:30 p.m., I called my best friend in the world, H. And the following day, H tells me that I was completely unintelligible on the phone, and J had ended up having to speak for me. J told H that I was safe and headed back to her apartment where I could stay the night if I wanted, or J could give me a ride back to my place. The two knew each other, so H felt I was safe, but knew something was up as I never am obliterated in public, especially after 9:30 p.m. So I guess I ended up passing out at Jay's as soon as we get back, and she stays up and orders me food and grabs me water to take care of me. I really don't know what happened. I only had 3 glasses of wine, and I can't remember a single thing happening after signing the bill. Although I did feel good, I wasn't necessarily drunk. I know my limits, and I know that I did not black out. I never felt any sketchy vibes at this restaurant, neither with the people working there or the customers while there. I feel like the only possible solution is that my drink was drugged. This happened when I was in college. For months, 1 year, I was getting these calls. Every time the call came in, I was sleeping, and I had a rather erratic sleep schedule, many times staying up nearly all night. But each time they called, it managed to be when I was actually asleep. I would wake up getting this call every few weeks, of someone on the other end whispering as quietly as possible. I couldn't hear what they were saying. I could just barely hear a whispering sound. The first few times it happened, I was so tired when answering that I just chalked it up to a wrong number. After a few times, it finally woke me enough that I registered that someone was on the other end and that this had happened before. It sounded very creepy, and like they might be getting their jollies off to waking me up. Just got a super scary vibe. They wouldn't reply to me inquiring who they were or why they were calling, so I just hung up. I mentioned it to my significant other at the time, and he said that he'd answer the call the next time. Next time comes around, and I answered first, but when I realized it was the whisperer, I handed the phone to my significant other, who yelled at them and told them to quit calling. That didn't stop them. And the next time, I'm just so livid I threatened to call the cops, but I know. What could they actually do about a whisperer? I could tell this whisperer was enjoying this because he continued to call, only when I was sleeping, all at different times of the night. So I decided to ruin his good time when he called again. I decided to acknowledge his enjoyment and take his taboo behavior to the next level. Well, the phone starts ringing and wakes me up once again, and I'm prepared this time. He starts whispering and I respond, "Ooh, I'm so glad you woke me up. I'm gonna take some of my warm poop and rub it all over myself. Oh, it's gonna feel so good. Do you like that?" He hung up and never called back. And I'm sure if he was in one of my college classes, he was looking at me differently the next day when he saw me. And no, I'm not actually into that stuff. Today I took my dog for a walk around the neighborhood. When I came back, I noticed a man I had never seen before pacing near the bottom of my street. There seemed to be no home in particular he was waiting out front of and just continued to pace. I went up to my street, and when I turned to look behind me, I noticed he was slowly walking up my street behind me, staring at me. I felt uneasy and decided, just in case, I would do a lap of the block so he wouldn't see where I lived and hopefully leave. As I turned around the block, I noticed him still pacing back and forth at the bottom of my street. I decided to walk back down towards him. As he saw me walking down the street, he turned and started to walk the other direction, then turned back again. We eventually came face to face at the base of my street. I approached him and asked if he was looking for someone. He said no and began walking up my street. I walked behind him. He then began jogging up my road. He suddenly dipped down my neighbor's driveway and approached them. I saw him hand them what seemed to be a card, turn and walk back down my road. My neighbors looked confused by the interaction, so I got the impression they didn't know him. I found it strange since my neighbors had been outside the whole time. Why did he decide to approach them now? While his back was turned, I quickly ran inside my home. I honestly don't know what to think of the whole situation. My gut feeling was that something was very off, but I can't know for sure. I'm curious what everyone else's thoughts are about this. I am 12 when I got on the bus 3 blocks from my house to travel to my friend's house. It was summer break and my parents are at work. They trust me and my brother to watch ourselves and travel small distances alone. As I get onto the bus, I happily sit in a seat near the middle, excited to be traveling alone, like an adult, I thought. I look around and make eye contact with the man sitting in the back corner. He's all alone, wearing a big coat despite the warm weather. He looks at me with these blank eyes and turns away. 15 minutes passed and it's finally my stop. I just have to get off, cross the street, and walk 10 minutes up a quiet suburban road to my friend's house. I step off the front of the bus and the man with the blank eyes steps out of the back. As I walk, I hear his footsteps behind me. I can hear his footsteps getting closer and closer. He remains 2 steps behind me, but I can hear him now, and I hear him mumbling, "Little girl," under his breath. I stop. He stops. I look behind me. He stares into my eyes and smiles. My heart is beating very fast now. I turn and feel the air move behind me like he stretched his arm out, and I speed walk away, thinking, anxious. I turn and walk up a driveway, pretending I'm going into my backyard. I get to the back of the house and press myself against the brick out of sight. I peek around the corner and the man is standing, staring at the driveway like he's trying to decide if it's worth to follow me. I run across multiple backyards until I reach my friend's street. I walk to her house, looking behind me every 2 seconds. I reach her door and I haven't felt safe alone since. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/Let'sReadOfficial, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks offered for the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations and save huge on data, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. Links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, don't use products with rubbing alcohol, because it dries out your face and makes you look older.